and now we're the gods we're waiting for. And knowing what we can do with the power of intention, we can change the outcome from potential catastrophe to changing a new world. And I will bet that's how we will actually bring about happiness and prosperity and also peace on earth. Because if we're all faced with the same problem and we gather together to get ourselves out of that problem, it would just maybe put down all the weapons for the first time in living history and cooperate. So that's my sort of vision for the future. I think it'll be very poetic if we can wrap up the 12,000 year cycle in a very positive way.
Freddy Silva, such a delight to have you on the program. Welcome.
Thanks, Anders, and hello, Scandinavia.
Hello, world.
And the world.
And the world, yes, excellent. Well, I have quite a few viewers and listeners in Sweden, but I think the majority are actually not non-Swedish. So, but anyway, I am in Sweden. I am in Stockholm. So,
I've not been. I've met a lot of people from Sweden, and they've all been lovely people. And I keep getting invitations. So one day I'm going to have to go and take them up on it.
Of course, yeah. Welcome anytime. Take a tour around Stockholm, another place. Maybe there are some megalithic sites here that I have never heard of that you could show me.
Yeah, there are.
Okay, great. You're such a fascinating, knowledgeable, and interesting person. You're an author, you're a speaker and an independent researcher into the field of, well, all human mysteries. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, pretty much. I've been doing this for over 30 years. I still don't know how to categorize myself. I think it falls into the subject of ancient systems of knowledge and ancient civilizations. That pretty much summed it all up.
Yeah, you've researched, as far as I understand. I've studied your website and other places and listened to you and followed you on TV outlets and listened to many interviews with you. And I understand you've researched the lost history of humanity and lost spiritual knowledge for at least 25 years. And you've published at least 9 books, or is it more perhaps?
It's sort of 8.5. I have one.
Okay.
I have one which is a self-help book, which technically doesn't. It's not really my book. It's really the sort of quotes by a lot of people as a sort of. I think I needed to put it together because people are feeling so down at the moment because of the situation around the world. So I just put some very uplifting quotes in the whole book. So I can't really take credit for it. So it's technically 8.5 books.
Okay, but it sounds like a commendable thing to do, to put uplifting quotes in a little booklet there. So, and you've appeared. Yeah, you've held innumerable lectures, of course, and appeared on Gaia Television and other networks. And not least, you regularly organize very popular guided tours to historically and spiritually charged sites. And what else? You're a native Portuguese who became a Briton and is now based in the fair northeastern parts of the United States.
Yeah, I'm trying to get out for reasons which you're probably familiar with. Yeah, no, I've actually, my heart is actually in New Zealand. I've been trying to move to New Zealand for over a decade. They don't make it easy. So I'm looking for about $3 million so I can buy my way in. So if anybody happens to have some money lying around, please let me have it. I'm very blessed to be a sort of a citizen of the world. I don't seem to understand how I end up with so many nationalities. I think someone upstairs wanted me to travel extensively and get on with my work. That's the only way I can explain it.
Well, to be a cosmopolitan is a very a good thing. I think I can resonate with that. I mean, I only have one citizenship, but I mean, if it were possible, I would be stateless, which sounds like a very bad thing in many people's minds, but to me that sounds like kind of perfect.
Because, or just to have a passport for a country where everybody likes you.
Yeah. Well,
like
this is a big topic, but maybe countries are a thing of the past when we go, 100 years from now. But anyway, let's not go there, at least not now. But I know that you speak and write a lot about portals on this planet. You point out that the ancient pyramids, temples, and other megalithic structures are actually, in fact, portals. So My first question to you would be, what are they portals to, and for what are they portals?
It comes down to how they're built and how, in ancient times, our predecessors always refer to the architects as understanding the laws of nature and how to bend the laws of nature to do what they did. And it's something that you hear about when you travel, and then you think, okay, maybe they're just making it up. But now that we have the science to measure the energy fields and the reason why they put these things where they are, I mean, I just finished doing a documentary on megaliths and the three major parts of the world, which are central Portugal, northwestern France, and Scotland, the biggest concentration of megaliths. And I wanted to find out why these three places above all others. And there's a real method behind it. When you start comparing notes and you visit and you look at the methodology, it turns out that all of these places around the world that we call temples, for lack of a better word, they are all located at places which are very seismically active. The foundation on which they stand creates an electrical charge or an electrical current along the landscape. So the landscape is already charged, and you can sense it sometimes if you're very sensitive. And also, the way that they chose the megaliths and the rocks to build their temples, and they'd go for hundreds of miles sometimes to locate these special stones. It's the ingredients in the stone. When you put them together and as a collective, they act as a kind of energy field. And what happens is that the laws of physics, as we understand them anyway, behave very, very differently in these sites, especially inside the passage mounds. These are the ones that are covered with earth. And then there's a whole passage of stones that goes into the interior altar. And only about 17% of these places, there are actually people buried in them. So there's 83% of sites where no one's buried, but they're called burial sites, which makes no sense whatsoever. So now we have the technology to understand that the weather inside these places and around these stones behaves very differently. And knowing what we now know about how the human mind and the body works, which works exactly on the same principles, that if you change the local electrical current of the world around you, then your mind starts perceiving things from another level of reality. So let's call it the other world for argument. And what happens is that if you can just shift the frequency of your body and your mind a little bit, a few degrees, you start perceiving something with greater clarity. So when you start connecting the science as to how the temples work and how the body works and match it to the local folklore as to how these places were mostly used for out-of-body experiences, for shamanism, for accessing information from an astral reference library, you put these things together, you think, okay, technically we can call them portals because they literally punch a hole in the way we view the third dimension, and they get you to access another level of reality. And then you come back with information about the universe, yourself, the nature of the spirit. You come back with ideas on how to make life a better place. I mean, Plato, Pythagoras, Leonardo da Vinci, all of these people also frequented these places in order to get the kind of information that led them to make the achievements that they have in their particular lifetime. So you can see how it works, and as a very positive way in which to help yourself make a better use of your time when you're here on the planet, and also make the world a much better place for everybody else. So that's why we call them sacred sites, or holy places, because they are whole. There's something that connects them to something greater than the physical world.
Mm. Are they placed on crossings between what's often called ley lines and other kinds of energetic lines that crisscross the Earth's surface, or is that something else?
Well, it's funny. Everybody asks me that, and I keep telling people ley lines are not energy lines. They are geometric alignments between three or more places. What we're talking about are the telluric currents, to call it in scientific terms.
Telluric?
Telluric currents,
Okay.
which are basically currents that flow along the Earth. And sometimes people call them the dragon lines or the fairy paths, the lung mei. Every culture has its own terminology, but essentially they are electromagnetic currents of energy that flow through the land, just like the human body has arteries, it has veins, and it moves the oxygen and the iron in the blood through your body, keeps you alive. Well, the Earth has exactly the same system, except you can't see it. They're invisible to the eye. But a sensitive person can actually sense them. And now we have the technology to actually map them. And I remember back in 2008, NASA making this statement that they've actually been looking at the way to map telluric currents that flow along the ground. I don't know why they're doing it. It's kind of interesting. But they've also added to this the fact that there are also these, what they call magnetic portals. I mean, they actually use that term, magnetic portals, that rise like a big spiral out of the Earth, and they connect to the solar wind, which basically is about 1,000 kilometers above the Earth's atmosphere. And that solar wind connects to the sun. So these portals open regularly every 10 minutes or so, and they send information, packets of information, up to the sun and possibly beyond that. The funny thing is that in India, when they wrote the Ayurveda, which is about 16,000 years old, keeps getting rewritten and rewritten and rewritten. It's a very old book. They talk about exactly the same thing, using very different and much more colorful language. So, and the fact is that whenever we find these crossing points where the telluric currents happen to cross on the faces of the Earth, you'll find a standing stone, a dolmen, a mount, a pyramid, a Stonehenge, and so forth. So our predecessors were sensitive to the environment. And then I think they had the foresight to think that we in the 21st century would lose the understanding of connecting with these things for our benefit. So they began to mark them with very large rocks. That's the only thing that makes any sense to me, that they mark these places which are highly sensitive, where we can interact with this energy because we can no longer sense it. Unless you're very astute and you work with the energy all the time. I mean, I do this all the time, so I can see these things. I become so sensitive to these currents that I can see them. Anybody can do this. It's not a special gift. We all have that ability, just like animals can sense them as well.
So they've built these. I mean, we're talking about everything from dolmens, as you say, which are huge stones, of course, but they're rocks, but they're not as big as, pyramids or what is left, the megalithic structures in Peru or Baalbek or other places. So all of those are basically the same kind of centers, portals for these energetically charged sites, and they built them. You say they built them primarily. What we see today are the remains of what they built for humanity, never to forget where these sites are, because they had this knowledge that in a few hundred or thousand years, people will forget. We will come to a dark age where people will not know about this thing. So we have to keep. Is that why they built it, or they must have built it in the first place because they needed it for their own connection, or was it only for as a warning or as markers?
There's two things that become very obvious. I'm talking about 30 years of experience on this now, by observing places on the planet where no one built anything. If you go to the American Southwest and hang out with the Hopi and the Navajo, they didn't build sacred sites. They know where the energy is. They can just go there. They can understand it. They can feel it and sense it, and they can work it. They call it powaha. It's an energy that if you connect with it, it expands the great person within. That's how they describe it. So, and that's why they call them increase centers. You are no longer just a physical person, you are super physical. That's their way to connect with the forces of the earth and the cosmos to go on a shamanic journey. Same thing in Australia with the Jalkidi. They call them the dreaming tracks. So they go from A to B for 50 miles, which is about 70 kilometers in the middle of the desert, and they go from sacred place to sacred place. So obviously it works. They can sense it, because if it doesn't, they'd be dead. You have no markers in the desert. And I figured, well, if they didn't build this, and then they began to build things and mark these locations from about 6,000 BC onwards, although there are examples which are much older, what was the point? And I think the idea was that we were slowly losing that contact. And it's actually to do with climate change, oddly enough. Every time there's a major climatic change upon the face of the earth, and there's been at least 13 of them since the end of the Ice Age, by the way. So what we're going through now is nothing new. And we survive every time, by the way. I sensed that they began to mark the places, A, because people were losing that connection, but also, oddly enough, those telluric currents, because they call them the serpent lines, they behave like serpents. They move, they wander. So if you're not sensitive to them, you go to the same location a month from now, and it's not there. The current has now moved miles down the road because it bends according to the movement of the rotation of the Earth and the core, to the movement of the moon, the sun, and so forth. And it also gets moved by human intention. You can move these things using the power of intention, because intention is an electromagnetic mechanism, and these things are also electromagnetic. So I think that they actually put the stones there to anchor them, to make sure they wouldn't go away. So today, if you go to sites, say in Brittany, in northern France, I've just come back from there, looking at the biggest standing stones on the planet. Man, these things are huge. I'm 2 meters tall, and I look like a fly next to them. It's incredible. And you think, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. They would drag this for a long, long way away. They would, and you have to drag this through forests, through rocks, through mountains, through rivers. It's very time consuming. Why? There has to be a real purpose to this. And the only thing that makes any sense is that the mineral inside the stone can also act as a kind of rod, kind of like an acupuncture needle. So when you mark the telluric currents, the stone can be programmed with all its quartz, with all its iron, and all the magnetite in the stone, to tell the stone, your job is to make sure that these energy lines are anchored to the spot. And now we know, because we can also measure the energy field of places like Edfu and Saqqara and Luxor in Egypt, and we find that the energy field created by all the quartz in the stones of the temples are punching a hole in the actual energy field of the Earth, and that energy doesn't go anywhere forever. It's always going to be there. So it's two things going on here. One is to mark that, X marks the spot, and two, to make sure that the current doesn't move at the sacred site when people forget where to find it.
Very interesting. I never thought of it that way. I mean, so many people are researching these ancient sites and ancient megalithic structures, but this thing but as you say, when you think about it, it's interesting that the Hopi, or the Aboriginals in Australia, never built anything. Why didn't they? So yeah, fascinating. But
yeah, they could sense it, and they can still do it, by the way.
Yes,
and I'll also add as well that there was a Frenchman who, Pierre Marot was his name. He was sort of a skeptic, which is a person that doesn't draw a conclusion about anything. And he was an electrical engineer. He actually went around Karnak in France, and it's 80,000 surviving megaliths. And that's a fraction of what remains, by the way. It's incredible just to think. This whole thing looked like a big forest of stone at one point. And he actually went around measuring the energy field of these standing stones. And he came to incredible conclusions. It's one of the best books. In fact, it's a pamphlet. I actually found it by accident in a little beach store in Karnak. Really, literally, I don't know why this book is not more important, because it tells you very clearly, in scientific terms, that the design of the actual building denotes its function. So the big menhirs behave like big solenoids. The energy of the Earth goes straight to the menhir, and then it behaves like a big coil. And it says that every 78 minutes, the energy goes into the menhir, it soaks it up, and then it releases it. So if you happen to be touching the stone at the wrong time, you will get a very large electric shock. And trust me, I've done it. And you can't feel your arm for like 5 minutes. Literally, you've lost all sensation. Any dowser can tell you this. And he says, no, it's measurable. The stones gather the energy, and then they have to release it in a burst of energy. Sometimes there's like a green light that escapes from the actual stone, and many farmers have seen this. And then again, the stone circles behave like big batteries. The energy gets attracted to them. And that's also part of a scientific experiment that was done at Avebury, the world's biggest stone circle, and also at Stonehenge. They put hundreds of electrodes around the monuments, and they found that in the morning, the ground current around the temples is drawn to the actual temples. And then just at the moment that the sun clips the horizon, the energy that's been going around the temple in the morning, suddenly there's a doorway that opens, and the energy goes into the middle of Avebury and Stonehenge at twice the frequency of the surrounding land. and no one can understand how the temple is able to double the natural frequency of the earth. That's quite incredible. And that was done back in the 1990s. So we're now gathering enough evidence scientifically to validate what people have been saying, and farmers have been saying for thousands of years, that there's an energetic quality to all of these sites.
Yeah. I visited Stonehenge and Avebury last summer, I think it was. Fantastic sites. Especially Avebury, actually, but mostly because there are so many tourists around Stonehenge, you can't really get to the stones there. But
it's like Disneyland. Like, I don't even take people there anymore. It's been ruined.
No, it's been ruined in a way. Yeah. Well, it's fantastic to see it, but I mean, you don't get closer than maybe, I don't know, 100 meters or something.
Yeah.
But Avebury was amazing, and you could actually. I mean, I'm not as sensitive as you, I'm sure, but I could sense that there was something very special about that place.
Very nice. Today, that's where I live. I was just down the road from Avebury. I was very spoiled when I was researching my first book. I used to have the choice of standing on the giant's grave, or going to Avebury, or going onto the mounds or the standing stones. I mean, that was my classroom. It was incredible. Wow. And yeah, I've seen Avebury. I've experienced Avebury in the morning, in the midday, in the afternoon, at night, which is incredible. Where it's very quiet, especially during the moonlight. The stones are twice as big as they are during the daytime. But I totally agree. I mean, the entire energy field of Avebury has been mapped, and it shows that the avenue of stones that leads into the site behaves like a particle collider, because the stones have their polarity. Believe it or not, stones do have a negative and a positive polarity. So if you face the stone towards the center of the avenue, and you have one stone which has a positive charge and one has a negative charge, and you're walking down towards the circle, you feel like you're walking in a river, and there's a stream that's taking you, like someone's shoving you from the back, sending you that way. But if you walk the other way out of the avenue, it feels like it's taking twice as long, because you're going against the field of current. And again, it wakes up every morning just before sunrise. The energy going through the two portal stones is huge. It's like a big current that goes through there, and it empties into the circle. And just like a person, slowly throughout the day, the energy slowly dissipates. It wears out, and it repeats again every single day. So that's been measured as well. So the whole thing literally is alive.
Yeah, so amazing. And nowadays, of course, science knows that I think the quartz in granite produces or generates piezoelectricity, I think it's called, under pressure. So they're actually utilizing that today in different kinds of devices and so on. So
a computer, for example, same process.
Yeah, same principle.
Yes, I mean,
and they knew it 10,000 years ago.
Exactly. I mean, like they said, the gods had complete control of the laws of nature. I'm not talking about invisible people. I'm talking about real people. Anyone who understands the laws of nature is a god. That's what the terminology used to mean, because a god is the spirit that's found in anything. The glass of water has a god. Light has a god. Grass has a god. It's a spirit that's found in anything. So if you want to understand water in all of its forms, you become the god of water. That's what it means. So they basically, and with pyramids, when you have all of that quartz lined up in these enormous buildings, yes, incredible things do happen at certain times inside the Great Pyramid. And I've experienced it enough times to see all kinds of unusual people coming out of the stones. And I'm not the only person that's seen this, by the way. When that happens to you, and when you're not expecting it, your life changes. But there's also a practical aspect beyond the spiritual aspect, and that is that in Central America, there was an experiment that was found to take the seeds and put them on the platform on top of the pyramids, for example, at Chichen Itza, because the locals were saying, well, how did they build so many temple cities in Central America with such a small population? They had to feed people. Well, it turns out that the way that the buildings are designed, with all the quartz, with all the piezoelectric activity, if you put the seeds on top of the platform, you can actually impregnate them with an electrical current, so you can get more yield and more agriculture, more crops. So where we would get 2 crops a year, they would get 5 crops a year. So it's not just a spiritual aspect here, it's also a practical aspect that's going on with all these sacred sites.
And maybe the population wasn't so small, after all.
I suspect that it was much bigger. I mean, we don't know.
You know what they're finding now with LiDAR technology? They're finding thousands of more pyramids underneath the foliage there in Guatemala and Mexico. So it's
they're everywhere.
They're everywhere.
I took a group there. We're driving back to the airport, and we're going along the road. And I went, and I have an excellent Maya teacher that I work with. I've learned so much from him. And I said, Miguel, pyramid, 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 and they look like mountains. They said, absolutely right. Yeah, they look too sharp to be natural
Yeah,
mountains. I said, yeah, we have pyramids everywhere. We haven't got the money to dig it up. And there was
exactly.
even a 16-year-old schoolboy in Montreal, I think it was, a few years ago, that using the sky-ground relationship, where virtually all the temples on the planet mimic a star or a constellation. And he said, if you look at the main temples in Central America, they should be aligned to the constellation of Orion, because there's a whole mythology behind it. And it's worldwide, by the way, the connection between temples and Orion, which is a whole other episode. And he said, there should be one here in the middle of the jungle. And of course, the archaeologist laughed at him. I mean, you don't laugh at a 16-year-old kid who's curious. You encourage that. Even if he's wrong, you
Yeah,
encourage that.
patronizing. Yeah.
And a year later, with LiDAR, they actually found the missing piece in the puzzle and proved him right. Will they admit that he's right? Of course not. That's just so wrong, So kudos to the 16-year-old school kid that was able to tell us what we already knew anyway.
Yeah, fantastic. So going back to the portals and the sites where they built these megalithic structures, as far as I understand, even the cathedrals built during the medieval and the Renaissance era are also built upon these sacred sites and these energetically charged sites. But that was after. I mean, that was well into the Christian era, and as far as I understand, this knowledge was long forgotten by then. But still, what I'm fishing after here is that this ancient knowledge was conveyed or relayed over the centuries and millennia by courageous groups like the Gnostics, the Cathars, and maybe even the cathedral builders who knew about it, but they were not really allowed to talk about it openly. Is that a fair description of what happened here? How this knowledge has been preserved to our day?
Yeah. About around the time of 1500 BC, the Earth was hit by some very serious outbursts from the sun. It incinerated part of the Near East, brings down the Bronze Age in Europe and the Mediterranean. And after that, we get to see a lot of war going on because there was inability to grow crops. People were fighting over land and the ability to maintain their integrity of their society. And it pretty much happened most around the world. Before that, there was hardly any fighting that was going on. It was much more of a collaborative effort, or at least there's no evidence to show that most civilization was killing each other. They're actually quite supportive of each other. So when things fall apart, everything goes out of the window and decorum disappears. So organized religion falls in, people are holding on to certain cherished beliefs, and we stop building temples. So the systems of knowledge go underground. They go into the mystery schools. The Egyptians go underground, the Greeks try to revive it, and then the Romans picked it up. They had no idea what the hell they were talking about, because by the time the Greeks picked it up from the Persians and the Egyptians, they were already not quite understanding what was going on. And you can tell by the mysteries of the Greeks, they're very hard to penetrate. They're very, very difficult to understand. They're quite right, but they're still very difficult to understand. So it takes another 1,000 years before the Templars, who were essentially the Essenes under a different name. They're following the same traditions of the Buddhists, by the way. They basically had the opportunity to go on the back of the Crusades, because they were not Crusaders. They went on the back of the Crusades, and they got the information from scrolls underneath Temple Mount. And some of the information was to do with how to build sacred sites, which the Essenes had inherited from the Mandeans, and they had inherited from the Persians, they inherited from the Egyptians. So it's an underground movement by now. So together with the Cistercian monks, who essentially were the same as the Templars, they worked side by side, and many Cistercian monks were also Templars, they reintroduced this concept of building sacred space disguised as a Catholic church. This is the best joke in history, where they go to the church, they say, look, we'd like to build some buildings to the glory of God. Of course, they don't tell you which God we're talking about here. We're talking about the God that has no religious denomination. And they were even given money to go and build the Gothic cathedrals. So they thought, wow, talk about a stroke of luck. So And they designed it with a cruciform shape to conform to the idea that Christ was crucified and honoring the crucifixion, which is absolute nonsense because they didn't believe in any of that. Nor did they, and they also realized that Christ was never nailed to a cross anyway. It was a metaphor, and everybody knew this. Even the Gnostic Christians knew it. And what they did was they located the original temples. Let's say Chartres is a great example. There's been a sacred site on Chartres Hill for 6,000 years, and it's still there. It's in the underground where the well of the strong happens to be. There's a doorway underneath the altar, and if you talk to the man nicely, you might get a glimpse into the original passage mound, and the stones are still there. There was an earthquake, two earthquakes that happened in northern France. One was in 1956, I believe, and another one in the Middle Ages. And the architects went under the building of Chartres to find out if the foundation was true. And that's when they realized, the building is built on top of an original passage mount. And the way that the Chartres align also gives the game away because Christian churches have to go east-west, whereas Chartres goes to the northeast. That means you're hiding something very old. So they were taking, the Templars and the Cistercians literally took the Arabic design, which is based on Persian temple design, and those Gothic arches that you see when you go into the building, that's the Arabic arch. So they use the same type of stone, the same alignment, the same movement of telluric current. And I actually have a little ebook on Chartres that shows you that where the telluric currents are, and they match the actual cross shape. So not exactly, because they flow, obviously, not in straight lines, but in curves. But the shape of the building literally is anchoring the crossing of positive and negative current that goes through the building. And also the underground water that goes through the building is also charging the limestone, creates an electrical current in the building. So they brought back and revitalized for the first time in 1,200 years the concept of building sacred space in the old way all throughout Europe, and they got away with it.
So yeah, you're right. It was the Knights Templar that were the builders, or those who administered the cathedral buildings, building of the cathedrals in the 13th and 14th and 15th centuries.
Yeah, and also the early Celtic Christian churches, anything before the 12th century, when the church finally realized what was going on, there were monks within the system of the Celtic Christian church that still understood the old traditions. Yeah. And because the story that we know of Jesus, it was inherited from Mithra. That was borrowed from the Mongolians in 5000 BC. It's a very old story. Hundreds of people did the same thing, and it's all metaphorical. It's an initiation, let's put it that way. So the early Celtic monks essentially understood the connection between the land, the currents, and the positioning of sacred sites. So the early Celtic Christian churches in Europe were still following the very old tradition. So they're giving, lip service to the new church, but they're following the old tradition. This is why it was so hard for the church to eradicate the old traditions in France and in Brittany and in Ireland. It still went on for hundreds of years later until people literally were murdered if they didn't go to church. So when you're faced with death, you might as well go to church. But the concept is still found in anything before the 12th century.
Yeah. Do all these traditions that we've mentioned here, Knights Templar, the Celtic Druids, perhaps the Cathars, the Gnostics, do they all converge back to Hermeticism, the Egyptian Hermetic principles?
Much older. It's much older.
It's much older, but that's where it converges, maybe backwards in time, and then they, of course, got it from way back.
It's hard to say. I mean, it's
you have spoken about the Bronze Age collapse and all that, and talked about 6,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago. But I mean, many of these independent researchers that you're part of course, they speak about eras way back before that. And you haven't even mentioned the Younger Dryas episode, which many believe was the time 12,000, 13,000 years ago when, for instance, the Atlantean civilization collapsed, the latest big cataclysm, the last one that we know of. But what are your thoughts on that?
That's what it goes back to. Okay. I wrote a book called The Missing Lands, exactly to address this issue. And there's a video that goes with it called The Missing Gods. So it's a lovely sort of connection between the two. But the idea was the fascination with talking to very ancient people on this planet to find out what did they have to say. about where this information came from. And again, 12 years of research, talking to strange people around the planet whose ancestors actually lived through the Ice Age. And they said, no, there was a parallel civilization that lived here on the Earth, the gods, and they had different names, but they belonged to the same brother and sisterhood. That's the thing that we always misunderstood, that, Viracocha and company were separate. No, they weren't. They were the same as the followers of Horus in Egypt, who were the same as the Anunnaki of the Armenian highlands, who became associated with Sumeria. But by then, they're already 6,000 years old. It's the same in Japan. It's the same in Central America with the Its, who eventually become the Maya 8,000 years later. So my job is to piece these stories together. And the one thing that connects them all is that when they finally, the survivors of the Great Flood in 9,700 BC, they suddenly are forced to go into the continental shelves because their islands where they lived have gone. I've located 7 of the 8 missing lands where they once lived, and they're now hundreds of feet below sea level. So when you're faced with extinction, you have to hang out with hunter-gatherers, with us. And that's when we discover the accoutrements of civilization. And that's noted by history. And historians accept that as being an anomaly when we suddenly discovered mathematics, astronomy, food production, and civilization all at the same time in the same period after the Great Flood. So the connection was, where did this come from? It didn't just arrive overnight, unless we're all doing shamanic journeying, which is possible. But the idea is that the gods arrived in boats from their missing lands in Japan in 8,000 BC at least. And there you will find 17 books that form the foundation of Shinto, which is one of the oldest traditions on the planet. And if you look at the books, only by title, because the books are actually missing, there's only 2 left. They are called the way of the gods. In other words, there are 17 profound teachings which tell you how to become a better person and how to work with nature. And it's the ways of Ise, which is Isis in Japan. Now, what's an Egyptian goddess doing in Japan? But if you look at the terminology that Shinto uses to this very day, that moves west to the Indus Valley with the concept of Mithra and the fact that he forms this incredible religion to discover yourself, and then he gets metaphorically nailed to a cross as well on the winter solstice. That eventually moves westwards to the Essenes and the time of Christianity. Meanwhile, in Egypt, you've got the same story where groups of gods in about 10,500 BC, right in the middle of the Ice Age, they know what's coming. They've already been that their homelands have already been partially destroyed by the beginning of the Ice Age, and they're going to Egypt to find a new place to live and to set their mounds upon which will be built the temples we know today. And it's written on the walls of the Temple of Etru. It's a beautiful story. And they said, no, then we had about 300 years before everything was destroyed again. So when we came back to Egypt, we finished building or rebuilding the former world of the gods, the mansions of the gods. And that's what we see today. So, and if you look at the terminology and the spirituality that they brought with them, that formed the foundation of spiritual mysticism in Egypt, which becomes the foundation of Christianity and Greek mythology as well. So when you start putting the pieces together, we inherited this from another culture who already had the exposure to the universal knowledge for tens of thousands of years. I mean, the Sumerians were dating things in the terms of hundreds of thousands of years. And after that, we don't know because the information is gone. But we definitely inherited it from someone else who experienced it, they've lived it, and now they gave it to us so that we can also raise ourselves from our mundane existence and become the gods that we were meant to be in the first place.
Yeah, yeah. Fantastic. And it's really interesting to note that the pantheons of the Greek pantheon, the Roman pantheon, even the Norse pantheon, and others are basically the same, actually.
Yes, they just changed the names.
Yeah, yeah. So it comes from one...
plagiarism.
Probably were the gods walking around on Earth with advanced knowledge sometime very, very, very long time ago.
And the stories are unusual because it's written in the style of the period. So you have to be very patient. Sometimes they're allegorical, sometimes they're metaphorical. Usually they're metaphorical. But they do teach you the accoutrements of how to become a better individual. That's what it comes down to. How to become, how to make the soul alive while you're trapped in this physical body. thinking that anything, the limited experience of the world is very unhappy. It's painful, but no, it doesn't have to be. And when you start dissecting the stories patiently, all the information you need to know about life and how to live it properly is all there. So the Scandinavian tradition with Thor and all these incredible people, if you strip away the incredible achievements and the almost fantastical stories, you can trace them back to India over 6,000 years ago. It's the same people doing exactly the same thing. Again, teaching you how to become a better individual. So it's quite funny that we seem to be borrowing from the same different traditions because it works. It's something that's of huge value to society.
Yeah. Let's compare Peru and Egypt a little bit. We haven't talked about Lemuria. I don't think you mentioned Lemuria, but we mentioned Atlantis. And you hear sometimes that there were too big, too basic, very, very early civilizations. And Lemuria or Mu was supposedly the earliest one. And then there was a later one that's called Atlantis that maybe rose and fell several times. I don't know. But when you go to Peru, I've been there. I've been to Egypt as well, but I was only 7 years old. I can't remember much, but I know I was in the Great Pyramid, but it was just dark and spooky. But anyway, in Peru, it's like the megalithic structures there, fantastic places, Sacsayhuaman, Ollantaytambo, and the city of Cusco itself. It's like the architecture is more organic, almost more feminine in a way than it seems to be in Egypt, where it's more straight lines and it's very impressive in many ways. But it's different. It's more feminine in Peru and more masculine in Egypt. Do you think that has to do with the very different age spans here? That Peru is kind of remnants of Mu or Lemuria, perhaps? Or what are your thoughts on that? What's the difference here?
Well, the thing to bear in mind in Egypt is that most of the temples that we see today and love are rebuilt by the Greeks. They're not Greek temples. They've been rebuilt. They've been refurbished because when the Greeks arrived, the Persians had destroyed everything. So what we see today is basically a reconstruction, but very accurate reconstruction. But if you look at things like the Osirian, which is over 12,000 years old, and I've already proved that in one of my books with the alignments, you see the same methodology that you find in Peru. If you go to the small pyramid in Giza, Menkauri's pyramid, which no one pays any attention to, look at the base of the original granite cover, and you'll see this exactly the same methodology that you find in Peru. So you're talking about age building upon building upon building. And it's the same thing in Peru, by the way. I don't know if you noticed when you go to places like Pisac, and even walking around Cusco, there are 4 different building periods.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
Big megalithic Sacsayhuaman, or sexy woman, as they call it locally. They've got a sense of humor. You've got these organic shapes, which, they're like pillows. They're like you're shaping bread.
They're like marshmallows that have been, melted and then put in.
Incredible design. And I found a stone with 16 angles, not just 12, 16 angles. It's in Sacsayhuaman. It's unbelievable. As if 4 isn't difficult enough to begin with.
In Coricancha, I think there's one rectangular thing there with 24 angles.
I haven't found that one yet. I have to go back.
Yes. Sorry to interrupt you.
And then on top of that, there you'll see another, especially at Sacsayhuaman, you'll see a second building technique. The stones are equally beautiful, smaller. Starts getting a bit more linear, much more finely finished, as if they're rebuilding after a catastrophe. Yes, that's when Viracocha comes back to rebuild the world of the gods, and that's in the local folklore. There was for example, Tiwanaku. The alignments of Tiwanaku to the horizon are 15,000 BC. That's how old Tiwanaku is. And the Aymara locally will say, "Oh yeah, the people were here already." And there was a huge Egyptian presence in Tiwanaku as well, which surprised the hell out of me. But then after the flood, Viracocha shows up with his 7 helpers, and they rebuilt what was already there. So now you're seeing the second phase. And you think, okay, well, that makes sense. They're following the same rules, but they're in a bit more of a hurry. There's not many people left, so they have to use smaller stones. And then another period goes by, a long period, where you see a much more shoddy workmanship. And you think, who the hell put this up here? And then the Incas show up, and they had to rebuild what was already there, and their handiwork is terrible. I mean, they were farmers. What do they know about stonemasonry? And their work falls apart as soon as an earthquake comes along. And then when the Spanish added their handiwork, it falls apart everywhere. They used mostly concrete more than rock. So you're going from age to age to age to age. But the joke that I usually tell people when I go on tour is, how do you know how old it is? You can tell how old it is by the bigger the stone and the more complex the design, the older it is. And the closer we get to our era, the shoddier and smaller the
Yeah.
masonry, and it falls apart. We're actually going backwards. We're actually going the reverse into what civilization is supposed to be doing. And that's very clear all around the world. But in terms of the way that where did this come from? I think that all this stuff was happening at the same time. Atlantis was already there when Mu, or as they called it, Lapukije in South America, or Kainga Nui Nui, the big land in the east, which is somewhere between Easter Island and South America. By then, what we call Lemuria had already broken up into the Pacific Islands anyway. There's a map that was found in a Chinese cave in 1904 that made its way to New Zealand, where it has one of the original maps of the Pacific with what remains of Lemuria and big, big islands. I'm trying to locate it. That's all I can say right now.
But is that where the most of the 7 lost lands that you found were located?
It was one of them. I've only found Kashkara, which is where the Hopi came from, which is somewhere towards Hawaii. Not Hawaii, but somewhere near Hawaii, because they don't give you the exact location, unfortunately. And Kainga Nui Nui and Lapukije had a couple more of them. But they used to be part of what we used to call Lemuria, a massive continent. But now we're talking millions of years. We don't know how old that stuff is. But it's the same thing in the Atlantic. I mean, if you talk to the Maya and they talk about the Its, who were the gods from from Atl. They were into big words back there. It's Atl. So Atl used to be a much bigger landmass, and there was a Russian research vessel that actually dredged up the remains of what used to be the original shoreline from between 2 of the islands in the Azores in the Atlantic, and they actually found the original the shore, including sand. And they also found rocks that trapped, that once exposed to oxygen. And that was at 5,000 feet below sea level. And it showed that this thing sank in a very rapid movement about the beginning of the first ice age. So we've had 3 ice ages in the last 17,000 years. That was the first stage. And then there was another stage where things collapsed. And the third one that we know so well called the Younger Dryas. So this has been going on for tens of thousands of years, the change of the Earth. All we know is the last ice age. And we know that there was at least 7 to 8 different land masses where the gods used to live, because the Egyptians talk about one in the Temple of Edfu. And it talks about the Island of Fire. And I've located it somewhere off the coast of Saudi Arabia. It's now about 200 meters below sea level. And it was a volcanic island. And when that went down during the Great Flood, Saudi Arabia came out of the ocean, because that's why it's full of sand, because something had to go down, something had to go up. Same thing in the Sahara. The Atlantic Ocean began behind the pyramids. And when Herodotus was there.
So there was no Mediterranean?
There was a Mediterranean, but not the way we knew it. It was much smaller, and it was the water that was behind the pyramids in what is now the Sahara. That drained that way. Part of that water goes to fill the Mediterranean to what it is today, and the other one goes all the way to Mauritania, and it goes into the Atlantic Ocean.
Where of course, where the Eye of the Sahara is.
Kind of,
the reshaped structure. What do you think of that? Was that one of the capitals of Atlantis?
It's a massive mud volcano. It's not man-made.
Okay.
A good geologist will point that out very easily. I mean, I was very excited when I saw it, but that is a massive mud volcano, because that was full of water and it was very volcanic at one point.
Yeah.
And in fact, if you just go 3 hours west of Cairo into the Western Desert, you will see massive outcrops of basalt and volcanic plugs everywhere. That's the ocean floor. There are entire mountains made of crystal out there, and I've seen them. It's an incredible sight. But literally, 200 meters of water disappeared in a blink of an eye, and it went that way. And when Herodotus was picking up these stories, the Egyptians still had a memory when they said, yeah, my ancestors remember when the water was just behind the pyramid here. And you'll see fossils everywhere, whales, everything. And they said, yeah, the water literally moved in the blink of an eye. Within a week, it went that way when the Earth flipped, because it was hit by meteorites. And the Hopi have exactly the same story in the Southwest. They said that the Grand Canyon wasn't carved in millions of years; it was carved in a week. And now we have new research that shows, yes, there was a lot of ice dams in Canada that fell down, and a wall of water went down towards Nevada. And if you're flying to LA, you can see the drumlins when you're flying over Nevada that shows the water sculpting the landscape very, very quickly. So sometimes things happen very dramatically, and that's what happened to the missing lands at the end of the Ice Age, where the gods used to live.
Yeah, yeah. Catastrophism as opposed to gradualism.
Yeah, I mean, if, for example, if you hadn't been in New Zealand about 6 years ago, they had a massive earthquake near Kaikoura on the east coast, and literally within 50 seconds, the seabed rose 3 meters. Okay, that's in 50 seconds, and that was a small earthquake. That was only a 7.2, not something ridiculous like a meteorite strike, which would create incredible havoc. In fact, I was looking at the research from Los Alamos Laboratory. They were doing some ballistics experiments, and they found, doing a simulation of what would happen if a kilometer wide or even a half a kilometer wide meteor happens to hit one of the Earth's deepest trenches, like off the coast of Peru. And they found out that in a scale model, the projectile hitting the Earth at the right angle will create a big hole in the ocean, and it creates a plume of water 3 miles high. And that water, when it comes back down into the hole, creates a big ripple, and it goes across the ocean, and you'll only experience this as big waves. And I have a story from Easter Island and in New Zealand that talk about their ancestors that said, yeah, that's when the Urukeu gods, who were the gods of South America, by the way, they were traveling on the ocean when they were met by the what are called the earth shakers, the meteorites that hit the water, and they destroyed one of their ships. And the other one picked up the survivors, and they went to the birthplace of the gods in New Zealand. But when that water reaches the continental shelf, going back to Los Alamos, they said that the original plume of water, which is 3 miles high, is recreated at the beach, and that water will go right inland for hundreds of miles. So when the people in Tibet talk about the fact that the water of the Great Flood, the tsunami, crossed the Himalaya and even reached Tibet, you know they weren't making it up. We can now have the ballistics report to demonstrate that it's absolutely possible.
Yeah, that's crazy. I mean,
it's quite scary, isn't it?
No wonder there was a restart of civilization 6,000 years ago, as Robert Schoch calls it. After maybe a few thousand years of dark age, there was a restart, and there was probably a very tight bottleneck, and maybe there were billions or at least 1 billion people living before the latest cataclysm, and then maybe just a few million people survived. So no wonder they lost knowledge about things.
Exactly. And I think this also accounts for the obsession the ancestors had with looking at the sky. I mean, the temples that they built.
Like in Göbekli Tepe, for instance.
Exactly. Like the pyramids of Central America. I mean, and the astronomies that they have. And it's like, well, why? I mean, you could just put some trees and located objects. Why build this obsession with long-range calendars? If you're a farmer, all you need to know is where the sun and the moon are, specifically the moon, to tell you how you're going to grow crops. You don't need calendars. I mean, the Maya have something like 14 calendars, and some of them cover almost 100,000 years. Why? You won't be alive in 100,000 years because they were obsessed with the sky. If you know what's happening in the sky and what's coming towards the earth, you can prepare. You can hide in caves and come back and relive it. That's why we have the caves in
and we are almost there today. NASA is almost as good as the Mayans were.
Oh, it's coming. 2036 and 2038, NASA knows that the big chunks of rock that created the Great Flood, they're coming back because it's called the Tauride meteor shower. That's why we celebrate the Day of the Dead around the world in November, even in the Southern Hemisphere, when we should celebrate it in May, not November. But they celebrate it in November. And they said, yeah, it's the memory that every November, the Earth goes through 17 days of debris. And we go, oh, look at that. What a beautiful thing that's happening in the sky. That's the remains of a mini planet that's going around the solar system and beyond. But the big chunks of those rocks are coming back 12,000 years later, which is the ones that were created the Great Flood. So NASA's actually quite concerned that these big chunks between 2036 and 2042 have a high degree of hitting the Earth. And you know what? The Maya calendar predicts that too. It's not about 2012. It's about the 2012 was a midpoint in the end cycle. It's a 30-year period this way, 30-year period this way. And they said it's the window of opportunity where the cycles change. It doesn't happen like that. The cycle moves over time. So the window of opportunity is there for you to get your act together. And now that we're hitting close to 2036 and 2042, which is the closing of the window, you can see how things are shaping up on the planet with climate change. Politics is now very black and white. People are fighting over nothing, and we sense that something is up, and we need to do something about it. Yeah, I think subconsciously we pick up on this. And the temple culture was designed to tell you this as well. It was meant and designed to survive until our period to show us, you've got to look at the sky. You've got to know where the energy points are. You've got to know where the portals are, because you've got to help yourself. When you're so immersed in the physical world and you don't see the wood for the trees, you have to know where to go to connect with the big picture so you survive, you see. So it's like and it's an insurance policy. And the Egyptians called the temples an insurance policy. And now we know why.
Yeah, yeah. So we have, what, about 30, no, what is it now? 20 years left to get our act together before it's too late?
Oh,
or something like
yeah, about 15, 18 years left.
Yeah,
so,
yeah. Okay.
and
But people like you are helping us to once again understand what's happening and what's really important and where we come from and who we are and all that.
I mean, the thing is, if you look at the ancient traditions, which, I mean, they kept their civilizations going for thousands of years, they were doing something right. We can't even keep a culture going for 3 decades before it all falls apart. If we're lucky, we can survive a decade without things falling apart. And the one thing I hear from the old cultures is, first of all, we're the gods we're waiting for. We don't have to wait for help. It's not coming. The help is there, but we have to help ourselves with the help that we're getting. Otherwise, it defeats the purpose of being here on planet Earth anyway. The point of incarnating is to make yourself a better person and leave the place in a better state when you found it. And what they were saying is that if you look at the old traditions and how we did things and we honor the elements, we honor the earth, and you look at the sky, you are better prepared. You can hide in caves, you can put food away. And then when you come out, you don't have to come back as cave people. You can restart civilization from where you picked up.
Yeah.
And I think that's very good advice, going back to the old systems of knowledge and applying them in your life. But the one thing I take heart in is the recent experiments with measuring consciousness. And the experiments at Princeton University are very important here because they are peer-reviewed, so they're accepted by science. But the fact that your intention is one of the most powerful things on the planet, and it can be measured. They developed a computer that can measure the energy field of a room or an environment before and after the inclusion of human intention. And one of the most famous experiments that I keep pointing back to is the one where 20 people were gathered in a room. And the point was, the intention was to look at this computer in the middle of the room and change the drum beat of a computer. And they succeeded. So if you use that now and extrapolate that to a bigger level, let's talk about the transcendental meditation movement around the world. They calculated that it takes 1% of the local population thinking of the same outcome to alter the outcome of your environment. So if you extrapolate that even further and you're faced with a big rock about to hit the earth, and it's going to take everybody out, absolutely. It takes 1% of the population of the earth with the intention of moving the rock to make sure that it goes away.
That's how they built them, probably.
Exactly. And 12,000 years ago, when you look at the story of the Anu and the Watchers from the Book of Enoch, and that's not his real name, by the way. His real name is Emed-Ur-Anu. The writer of the Book of Enoch was an Anunnaki. So you've got to go back to the original story. They talked about originally when the earth was being overrun by these red-haired giant people called the Nephilah, the children of Orion, who were terrible offspring between the illegal mating of the gods with the humans, which was not going to work genetically. That's where the problems begin. And it's only a small group of troublemakers, by the way. It's not all of them. It's only a small group of troublemakers. We've got to keep that in mind. They talked about, the Lords of Anu said that we used our God-given ability to move the rocks to make sure that they hit the earth at the right places to wipe out everything. And they said, most of the gods are going to die as well, but who's going to volunteer to be here to tell the surviving humans and give them the accoutrements of civilization? That's where the groups of gods said, yeah, we'll stay behind and we'll survive, and then we'll go and teach the hunter-gatherers how to build civilization. And there's a story right there.
Yeah.
So it's funny that 1,000 years later, we're facing the same issue. And now we're the gods we're waiting for. And knowing what we can do with the power of intention, we can change the outcome from potential catastrophe to changing a new world. And I will bet that's how we will actually bring about happiness and prosperity and also peace on earth. Because if we're all faced with the same problem and we gather together to get ourselves out of that problem, it would just maybe put down all the weapons for the first time in living history and cooperate. So that's my sort of vision for the future. I think it'll be very poetic if we can wrap up the 12,000-year cycle in a very positive way.
Wonderful, wonderful words to wonderful note to end on. I know you have to leave soon here, but you're just beginning to talk about the very deep history and how Homo sapiens was created and all that. But maybe that's a topic for another time. Maybe we can talk again someday, because I have 100 more questions about different kinds of things. Freddy, you have a website where people can go if they want to find out more about you.
Oh God, yes. Yeah, all the documentaries, all the books, all the articles will all be there. It's called invisibletemple.com.
Yeah, I'll put the link in the description box, of course. Thank you so much, my friend, for taking the time. And
thank you for having me on.
Keep up the good work.
Thank you, my friend. Be well.
If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe and don't forget to hit that like button and share the video with your friends. Please support the channel if you can. I appreciate all the support. You can become a Patreon for as little as $1 a month, or you can make a one-off donation via PayPal if you wish. All the links are in the description box below. Thank you.